Right. Watching people fill the room. Welcome, everyone, to Peer Review and You, a publishing workshop offered by the University Press of Florida. The webinar today will include presentations from the 5 acquisitions editors at the press. You'll be hearing from each of us, Carlynn Crosby, Janie Chan, Mary Puckett, Sean Hunter, and me. I'm Stephanie Hunter, the editor-in-chief at the University Press of Florida. Each editor will be talking through a different aspect of peer review. Now, first, I wanted to give a few pointers on the guidelines for this panel. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, Florida Press. After the webinar, registrants will receive an email with a link to the recording. Closed captioning has been enabled. To view the closed captioning, please click on Closed Caption in your meeting controls. Please submit any questions for the panelists through the Q&A throughout the presentation. We will address questions at the end as time allows. We will share contact information for University Press of Florida editors at the end of the presentation, and we hope that you will reach out to us with any additional questions. And with that, we can get started. I want to start with a brief introduction to the University Press of Florida for those of you who are not familiar with us. The University Press of Florida is the official publisher for the Florida State University system. UPF and its imprint, the University of Florida Press, publish both scholarly and general interest books in a range of subjects that you can see on the screen. As a member of the Association of University Presses, all of our books, both scholarly and general interest, are thoroughly vetted before publication. Peer review is one of the important methods of vetting publication, and it's a cornerstone of university press publishing. So before we dive into the details of peer review, I wanted to give a brief definition. Peer review is the process through which experts or peers provide feedback on the contribution of a work under consideration for publication. Peer reviews are formal evaluations that become part of the book's publication record. Editors commission these formal evaluations, and the reviews are then shared and discussed with authors. These evaluations help the editor and the author develop the book to become the best that it can be. Later, these evaluations are shared with the press's faculty editorial board when the editor requests final publication approval for each project. The Association of University Presses issues a guide on the best practices for peer review to ensure rigorous and equitable peer review. We're going to include a link to this guide and other resources on peer review at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carlynn, who's going to tell us more about the when and how of peer review.
Thank you, Stephanie. As she mentioned in her introduction, peer review is a cornerstone of the acquisitions process and of scholarly publishing more broadly. It is also one of the more time-consuming parts of a book's life cycle, aside from the actual drafting of the manuscript. In this segment of the webinar, I'm going to go over where peer review occurs in the process, as well as some logistical information about peer review at the University Press of Florida and the kinds of questions we ask of peer reviewers for scholarly monographs. If you're asked to review a manuscript, you'll hear about what kinds of information we're asking you to assess. If you're an author, you'll get some insight into the kind of feedback you'll receive on your manuscript. For now, this is just an overview. My colleagues will be going into more depth about the recruitment process and the evaluation of feedback for scholarly and trade books shortly. The infographic on your screen is Florida's life cycle of a book. You'll notice that peer review occurs after the submission of the manuscript and before editorial board approval. At Florida, this means we send the full manuscript out for peer review rather than the proposal and/or sample chapters. We cannot move forward with the project until it has been recommended for publication by 2 to 3 subject area specialists and the series editors if the project is proposed for inclusion in one of the press's scholarly series. As I mentioned, peer review is one of the more lengthy processes of scholarly publishing. We ask that reviewers return their reports within 3 months, though this can sometimes take longer as we try to balance authors' expectations for timely feedback and flexibility with reviewers' schedules in support of this invaluable service to scholarship. We keep authors as up to date as possible throughout the process, communicating about timeline extensions, schedules, and returned feedback as quickly and as transparently as possible. You'll notice on our peer review form, which we send to all reviewers once they agree to evaluate a manuscript, that there are several options for recommending publication of a manuscript. Publication with viewer optional revisions, publication with revisions suggested, publication contingent on major revision and further review, and do not publish. Reviewers don't always recommend publication with few or optional revisions in the first round of review. We anticipate a manuscript might go through multiple rounds of peer review, also called revise and resubmit, sometimes one or even two more times before it is recommended for publication. While this review process might be long, it is part of our commitment to rigorous scholarship of the highest quality. We want your book to succeed as much as you do. Since we're talking about the form, you'll notice above that we provide some questions to guide reviewers through their evaluation. Whether you're a first-time or a seasoned reviewer, incorporating feedback to these prompts in your report helps us ensure that the review is as thorough as possible. We ask about the contribution the manuscript makes to scholarship, the overall quality of the work, the extent to which the manuscript addresses the viewpoints of underrepresented groups, and suggestions for revision if there are any. Mary will discuss how we as editors evaluate this feedback soon, but in sum, we're primarily interested in a peer reviewer's thoughts about audience, contribution, and quality of the scholarship. We value suggestions for revision, particularly guidance for better argumentation, as well as noticeable fact errors or useful additional citations. At this stage, we do not ask peer reviewers to copy edit the manuscript. Our editorial department will handle copy editing at a later stage in the process. We also ask that peer reviewers not use AI in their evaluations and to not disclose their review to their colleagues for the sake of the integrity of the process. On the next slide, you'll note a few other options for our peer reviewers: the option to remain anonymous or to reveal their identity, the option to use portions of their review for a blurb or to provide a new blurb, and the option for a complimentary copy of the published book. We recognize and value the time reviewers take out of their own work and schedules to provide feedback to their fellow scholars. So in addition to offering this complimentary copy of the published book, we also offer honoraria to our reviewers at Florida in the form of either cash or press books. In sum, I've broadly discussed the logistics of peer review, including when it occurs in the process and what sorts of feedback we ask from reviewers. I've been promising that my colleagues will provide more in-depth information, so now I'll turn things over to Janie to talk about how editors recruit peer reviewers.
Thank you, Carlynn. I will be discussing how acquisitions editors select peer reviewers. First slide, please. Okay. Our goal is to secure 2 to 3 readers for the review. This helps us ensure that the reviewers can speak to the various aspects of the project. It can also help minimize potential delays in the review process. The first stage is an assessment of the project. There are 4 key questions that we try to answer in the process of assessment. First, what is the project about? We identify what the main topic is and what the themes of the manuscript are. Second, who is the author trying to reach? Are the primary readers scholars, professionals, field practitioners, policymakers, or the general public? The potential audience is not limited to one group, but we want to know who the author most wants to reach. We think about what the goals of the authors are with regards to their manuscript. I like to discuss how the author hopes that the work will inspire others in their scholarship, actions, or perspectives. What is the impact that the author hopes that their manuscript will have? This information helps us identify reviewers who can be a gauge for the potential reception a project may receive should it be published as is. We also try to identify whether the project will primarily be of interest to readers living in a particular region or whether the project will resonate with a wider geographical range of readers. If so, where might the project be of potential interest? This helps us identify whether our reviewers should have experience with a specific geographical area. Third, what additional groups might be interested in the project? For instance, the primary readership might be scholars working on the same topic, but the manuscript's use of narrative and minimal use of technical terms also makes it accessible to a general reader with an interest in the subject. Fourth, does this project address the experiences of underrepresented communities? We evaluate what communities are impacted by the topic, and we also look at whether there are perspectives that have historically been ignored when discussing this topic and try to be proactive in selecting reviewers that are either a member of an affected community or have demonstrated long-term direct engagement with and investment in these communities. The second stage is research and execution. There are multiple components to this stage which are intended to help us find appropriate reviewers and reach out to them. First, how do we triangulate the reviewers? We identify what expertise is key to assessing the project, including experience with the topic, themes, and primary audience. We identify what expertise is valuable but not absolutely necessary. This is often tied to potential readers who may be interested in the project, but may not necessarily be part of the primary readership that we are trying to reach. We also determine what types of expertise we would like to see in the reviews, whether we seek readers whose primary expertise is scholarly, professional, in the field, as authors, or as members of affected communities. Most commonly, we seek a mix of some or all of these types, depending on what the goals of the project are and the potential readership. It's possible for our reviewers to not only come from different career, research, or expertise tracks, but also from different career stages or levels of experience. This helps us ensure that we have an inclusive reviewer selection. Second, what methods do we employ to identify potential readers? We look at the authors, endorsers, and book reviewers of already published books on similar topics and check for mentions of specific books in the published reviews. We also check who the readers were for the peer review process if the similar books were published by us. If the project is intended for a non-specialist reader, we look at books that resonate with the themes and context but are not necessarily on the exact same topic. We look for articles written either for scholarly journals or publications intended for the general public that resonate with the manuscript. We look at conferences we think might be a good fit for the project and see who has submitted a conference paper or participated in a panel on this topic in the past. We check who is active in professional and community-based organizations and societies that would also have an interest in the subject. Do they also have experience that speaks to other aspects of the project? We usually have an initial list of potential readers from the authors. We consider and reach out to them based on previously mentioned criteria. We also reach out to our contacts that might work in that field for recommendations for potential readers. Finally, how do we select who to contact and how best to reach out to them? It is important to note that it is not necessary for each individual reviewer to have expertise that speaks to all of the key variables. However, each of the key variables must be accounted for between all of the reviewers. When examining potential reviewers for a project, we look at affiliations to help confirm expertise, but also to avoid potential conflicts of interest. This will be discussed in greater detail at a later stage when we speak about the ethics and challenges of peer review. We make note of the topics of interest to potential readers, their contact information, and why we think they might make an appropriate reviewer. Our emails include information on the title, author, length, our review timeline, a 1 to 3 sentence description of the project, and a sentence as to why we would like their insights. For those who respond but decline, we check if they have anyone else they would recommend as a potential reader. And next is my colleague Mary, who will give us more details about peer reviewer feedback.
Thanks, Carlynn. Sorry. Thanks, Janie. I'll be discussing how to approach peer reviewer feedback from the standpoints of peer reviewers, acquisitions editors, and authors. Okay, next slide. The first thing to note is that peer review is not the same as copy editing. So peer reviewers do not need to provide feedback on details like spelling, grammar, or punctuation. And then, as Stephanie said at the beginning of this webinar, peer review is intended to improve a manuscript. So ideally, comments are shared in this spirit with a constructive tone and keeping in mind that there is an author on the receiving end of the peer review. And Carlynn shared some specific questions that UPF asks peer reviewers to respond to, but in general, the elements of manuscripts that reviewers are asked to assess include the factual accuracy of the content, whether an author successfully outlined and made their argument, how well the manuscript has been organized for clarity on the topic, and reviewers should tell us if the language is too jargony for the intended audience, whether ideas have been explained well, or if there are overly long sentences, or other reasons why the quality of the writing interferes with the readability of the manuscript. And finally, be sure to offer positive comments. If a reviewer notes that there were elements of the manuscript that were particularly compelling or enjoyable, this is very helpful because it's important for authors to also know what they're doing right. Okay, next slide, thanks. So when editors receive all the peer reviews for a project, they study the reports to assess next steps. Acquisitions editors are not experts, and so we think about whether we as non-experts are able to evaluate the final revisions that have been requested, or if an expert needs to review the requested changes. And if acquisitions editors are unable to evaluate the revisions, that means that the manuscript needs to undergo further external review. So once we've decided on a plan for next steps, acquisitions editors will write a letter to authors, synthesizing the reports and highlighting the most important comments from the reviews and explaining to the author next steps in the publication process. Okay, next slide. As an author, receiving peer reviews can be very stressful and overwhelming. So the first step when you receive the email from your editor with the reports is just to respond to the editor to acknowledge that you received them. And after that, take some time to process the reviews, reading them through several times. Approach the comments with an open mind, and remember that the reviewer's comments are intended to make the manuscript better. Start to consider which suggestions you may want to implement, keeping in mind that it is okay not to implement all of the reviewer's suggestions. When you're ready, the author should prepare a letter of response to the peer reviews, which is submitted back to the acquisitions editor. This letter should reflect an author's engagement with the reports, noting which suggestions were particularly helpful and whether there were suggestions that don't make sense for your project, and explain why. This letter is shared with our faculty editorial board when we proceed to final publication approval, and if further external review is necessary, this letter is also returned to peer reviewers with the revised manuscript. So it's important to keep these audiences in mind when writing the letter. And don't be afraid to reach out to your acquisitions editor for guidance on tone or content. In addition to the revision plan, the letter should outline the anticipated date when the revised manuscript will be ready for peer review or final publication. And then authors return the letter to the acquisitions editor for approval and can proceed with final revisions. And now I'm going to hand it over to Sian, who will be talking to us about peer reviewing trade projects.
Thank you so much, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the peer review process for trade books. I'd like to start with a few general observations, the first of which is that the procedures for external evaluations of trade book manuscripts are very much the same as my colleagues have outlined for scholarly books. We solicit 2 to 3 readers, usually triangulated across different viewpoints, from whom we seek constructive comments. Then the editor and the author work through the reports and comments, and we guide the authors on a formal response and revisions plan when necessary. What differs, however, are some of the elements that we're seeking feedback on. And the distinctions here arise from audience considerations. A trade book is intentionally developed and published for general readership, not one's fellow academic specialists, as with a scholarly monograph. Next slide, please. The types of trade books that UPF publishes range from biographies, cultural histories, and creative nonfiction to outdoor guides, cookbooks, and photography books. These books might be a personal purchase or they might be given as gifts. In all cases, the writing needs to be lively and be easily accessible for a broad public audience. One might ask then, why put a trade book through external peer review at all? One plank in UPF's mission as a university press is realizing public service through publishing books for general readers that are thoroughly accurate. That is, the books are as edifying as they are enjoyable. And so for trade books, we often seek outside readers with professional experience related to material in the book. The reader for a trade book may be a lawyer or a chef, a musician, or a museum curator. They may never have even published a book themselves, but their deep practical knowledge and specific community engagement offer valuable perspectives on the soundness and reliability of material in the book for a general audience. Next slide, please. To elicit the most helpful guidance from peer reviewers of trade manuscripts, we send a form out that provides different prompts than in our scholarly form, as you'll see represented in the questions in this slide. One of the questions explicitly asks readers for their input on the accuracy of information in the book. Also, we're particularly keen to hear what our outside readers find compelling in the book, as that feedback can confirm an aspect that we think is appealing, or it can alert us to an as yet unrecognized element that perhaps we should make more of in revisions. Feedback here can also help us position a book more effectively in the marketplace. For instance, lots of Southern cookbooks already exist. So what aspects are the readers picking up on that we can highlight that will help improve the book for the marketplace? We also ask trade readers about audience. Feedback here can help the author and the editor know whether elements like tone, context, or writing style are calibrated well for the intended readership, or whether they need additional work. We asked several related questions about structural elements of the proposed trade book. For instance, hearing what readers think about the organization of a guidebook gives us insight into whether the information is being communicated well or is located in the most useful logical place. Ditto inputs on length. While generally speaking, shorter is better for a trade book, we don't want to hinder a book's effectiveness if adding material will help it succeed. These questions also provide opportunities to hear what readers think about illustrative materials such as maps, or perhaps they think adding an element such as a glossary would help enhance reader experience and comprehension. One of our questions also asks readers whether they are aware of any similar books in progress or are already available. The offerings in the trade book realm are numerous and widespread, and it's difficult to stay abreast of all the new books from big commercial presses as well as the many regional houses. So we welcome all eyes and ears on any related books we may not be aware of, which helps us plan and differentiate our book while it's still in development. Finally, I'll note that our trade review form asks for opinions on inclusivity as well as revisions, which are questions found on our academic review form, because that feedback is integral to all books, whether they be aimed at scholarly or general audiences. So I'll close there, and our final topic is ethics and challenges of peer review with Stephanye.
Thank you, Sian. I have to say, my favorite slide of this entire presentation is the one with our book covers. If you can't tell by now, we put a lot of time, thought, and care in the books that we publish, and we are tremendously proud of them. So back to peer review. When peer review works well, it's a thoughtful and collaborative conversation through which the editor, author, and reviewers work together to make a book the best it can be. In order to ensure that the process works well, there are a few ethical considerations. First, the editor will enlist peer reviewers who do not have a conflict of interest with the author or the project. We avoid recruiting reviewers who have a relationship with the author. This includes the author's dissertation advisor or members of their dissertation committee. We will not enlist reviewers who teach at the same institution or work with the author. And we will avoid soliciting reviews from members of the author's graduate cohort. Other conflicts of interest might be someone who is closely associated with the author or with their manuscript, perhaps someone who worked on the research project on which the manuscript is based. Peer review should not be a form of gatekeeping. We look for reviewers who will, quote, read intentionally to imagine the field expansively and encourage bold ideas that expand existing conversation. This is a quote from the Anti-Racist Scholarly Reviewing Practices. This is one of the resources that we link to on our peer review forum. And we'll also be including it later on the slide of additional resources. We want peer reviewers who will not be biased against a scholar based on seniority, gender, race, language, nationality, or religion. And we ask reviewers to avoid hostile or inflammatory language in their reviews. Instead, we want reviewers who will judge submissions based on merit alone and who will be constructive in their feedback, even if this feedback is critically constructive. Now, if an editor does receive a problematic review that they feel is biased or inflammatory or problematic in some other way, they have a few options. The editor may choose to edit or reframe the review before sharing it with the author in order to highlight the useful components. Alternatively, the editor may choose to discard a review entirely and exclude it from the formal process. Now, we don't make this decision lightly. It's done with careful thought and in close collaboration with the press's editorial team. In addition, as Carlynn mentioned earlier, we ask that peer reviewers not use AI in writing their reviews. Anonymity is an important part of peer review. So authors are not anonymous to the peer reviewers because it's really difficult to anonymize an entire book manuscript. However, peer reviewers do have the option to remain anonymous to authors. If the reviewer does choose anonymity, we will only share the reviewer's identity with other press staff, the series editors, if applicable, and the faculty editorial board. In return, we ask peer reviewers not reveal their role as a reviewer on a specific manuscript to parties other than the editor or the author. Next slide, please. Peer review is a wonderfully collaborative process, and for me, it's probably the most exciting part of the publication process. However, in the past few years, we've noticed increased challenges to peer review. So UPF, as Carlynn mentioned, reimburses peer reviewers with either a small honorarium or press books. But we realize that this payment does not adequately reflect the amount of work that goes into reviewing a manuscript. Peer review remains, at its core, an active service to the field, in which scholars provide feedback on manuscripts for the betterment of their field. Now, with the reduction of tenure-track positions, there are fewer scholars who have the time to provide peer reviews. These scholars are often burdened by increased faculty responsibilities, which further limit their ability to conduct service to the discipline. So editors try to be respectful of these schedules and accommodate peer reviewer schedules as much as possible. But of course, a longer peer reviewer schedule can be difficult for authors who may have their own promotion and tenure deadlines. One approach that UPF has taken to this peer review crisis is expanding who we invite to provide peer reviews, perhaps to include more junior scholars or experts from the community. This requires more education on how to be a peer reviewer, as this skill is often not taught. University presses continue to champion the necessity of peer review and the incredible service that peer reviewers offer to their colleagues and their disciplines. We encourage universities and departments to also recognize this important work conducted by their faculty, and we encourage scholars and community members to provide reviews if they are given the opportunity. So you can find a list of additional resources on this slide, and my colleague Jenna will be sharing the links in the chat. And with that, I'm going to ask all of the editors to turn on their cameras, and we're going to stop sharing the slides so we can answer some questions. Don't forget to put any questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. There we go. All right, so my first question is for Mary. Mary, what happens if peer reviewers disagree?
So this doesn't happen terribly often, but sometimes we will recruit 2 peer reviewers for our project, and they will have very differing opinions on their estimation of a manuscript. When that happens, there are a couple of, I guess, steps that I would take next, which would be I might talk to the author and ask the author some questions about the manuscript, depending on what the report said. But typically the next step is that we would need to recruit a 3rd reviewer to sort of break the tie, which unfortunately would add to the review process. But it's not something that happens particularly often.
Thank you, Mary. My next question is for Carlynn. So this author has received their reviews, and the reviews recommend publication with fewer optional revisions. So what happens next?
So we will take the project to our faculty editorial board for their approval. The purpose of the faculty editorial board is to review the peer review process. They're reading the reports, they're checking how editors have guided authors through their revisions, and they're also reading those revision letters to ensure that revisions have been addressed. And if revisions have been not addressed, they're looking for justifications as to why. The faculty editorial board is the last step of approval before a book gets transmitted to our editorial design and production department. One thing to note is that we have our quarterly editorial board meetings quarterly, like I just said. We meet with our editorial board 4 times a year. And so if you receive your reports, let's say in September, our next editorial board meeting would be in November. So unfortunately, we can't proceed with the project until it receives editorial board approval. But as I mentioned, editors are very transparent. We work very hard to be very communicative with our authors. And so we will let them know what the schedule looks like. If you've received all of your reports and we're still a month or so out from our next editorial board meeting, we will communicate that with you and let you know that we can't proceed forward until we've met that stage, but that it's coming.
Thank you, Carlynn. I'm going to send the next question to Sean. So one of our viewers said, did I hear right that you only send books out for review and not proposals? So I was wondering if you could talk about the different review practices and how we evaluate proposals at Florida.
Sure. Generally speaking, Florida does send full manuscripts out for review. On occasion, we will send a proposal out for review if there's going to be a long developmental phase, if there's some particular considerations that we need to look at. We find that it's better to have the full manuscript reviewed because that gives you and the author the most amount of feedback possible. It's also the best and most fullest expression of the work, the argument, the concept. And proposals are wonderful. They're very important materials, but they're before an author may have gotten into the complete set of research or data if it's a scholarly book, or completed all the photographs if it's a photography book. So it's an early stage. It can give you good feedback, and some publishers do proceed that way. But at Florida, we prefer to get the most feedback possible on the best, fullest, most complete manuscript we can get from the author at that stage, and then use that feedback to make it better through the revisions process.
Thank you, Sean. Next question, I'm going to hand over to Janie. So one of our listeners is asking who our authors are. They wonder if being on faculty at another Florida SUS school like FAMU, if they are able to publish with the University Press of Florida.
Okay. So we actually have a pretty wide range of authors. A lot of it depends on the book topics. We absolutely welcome faculty members from the SUS schools. In fact, that's something that we look at because it's part of our mission, I guess, at University of Florida or University Press of Florida, sorry, is to kind of help disseminate a lot of the research and topics of interest in the state more widely to the community around us. And I think in that way, we share a lot of the same mission as the faculties at the state university systems. So yeah, that's something where we are always happy to hear from faculty, but also from just other residents and community members in Florida itself. As I said, it's also not absolutely necessary that you need to be a scholar in order to be an author with us. So what's helpful is to kind of look at some of the books that we've already published and see what resonates with the ideas that you have. I think that's really helpful for us when we know what specifically about us as a publisher resonates with what you would like to do with your book project.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, please reach out to us if you're from SUS school or beyond. Our mission is to publish for the Florida community, and that includes the SUS schools. I kind of fielded that one over to Janie because she works on environmental studies, and I know she has authors from many of the different SUS schools. So that is definitely something that we encourage you to reach out to an editor. And we'll be sharing that contact information again. I'm going to take the next question, if that's okay. It says, thank you for the webinar. Could you talk about the book proposal? How advanced should a book proposal be when someone is reaching out to us? And can a potential author contact you with an initial idea? Yes, please contact us with initial ideas. My colleagues might be able to put this in the chat. We have a submissions page on our website. It lists the subject areas that we publish in, and it also has an email address. You can send an email of inquiry where you briefly describe your project, and we will send that email to the editor that best fits that subject area. That editor will take a look at that email of inquiry, and if it looks like a good fit for the subjects that we publish in, they might invite a full proposal. That submissions page also has our proposal guidelines on it, so you can take a look at that. I would recommend submitting a proposal when you can fill out the proposal guidelines. It's going to ask some questions about audience, about your book's contribution, about books that are similar to yours. You should be able to have a good idea of those answers. Another part of the proposal is the annotated table of contents. And that's where you give write out the table of contents that you are currently expecting, and then a brief abstract of each chapter. I like when authors send proposals when they have a pretty good idea of how they think the book is going to be structured. I see the proposal as a really helpful tool for the conversation between me and the author on how the project's goals, on its audience, and establishing a plan for moving forward. It gets us on the same page. So when you first reach out to us, send us ideas, but submit a proposal when you are able to kind of fill in those proposal guidelines sections. Thank you for that question. Our next one, I'm going to go back to Sian with a question on trade books. Do all publishers send out trade books for peer review?
Not exactly. I will say that amongst our colleagues in the university press world, most do. There are a few occasions where perhaps there's an imprint at that university press that's all trade books, and through particular rationales that have been discussed with that particular press board, they may not send those manuscripts out for review, but those are really exceptions. Amongst university presses, pretty much everybody sends out all their books, trade or scholarly books. In the commercial realm, it's very different. I have not worked there, so I can't give you a very complete picture there, but I would say that it's rare. I think that there may be instances where there's some informal feedback sought out, or maybe the editor at a commercial press suggests an author, sends it to some friends, right? But then that's that friend bubble. It's not the same type of peer review process that university press is set up to get rigorous objective, candid reviews that we find are so valuable. But they have different elements, different priorities and processes at commercial presses. So that's their model. Our model seeks out the peer review process.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And I would say, I mean, if you have that question about a different press that you're considering submitting to, ask the editor. Get more information about their specific processes, because there are some variations. A follow-up question, sorry, Sean. So UPF does send out trade manuscripts for peer review. Does the timeline for trade manuscripts differ from the scholarly manuscripts?
They can. One aspect of trade book publishing is timing the release of the book in the marketplace. And ideally, we try to have our trade books released in the early part of the season. So for the fall season, that's September. For the springs and summer season, that's in March and February. We are not always able to retrofit our timelines in peer review to make each one of those preferred windows, because really, I mean, we don't want to shortchange that peer review. It's integral to our process. But there are times when, I mean, the timeline for reviewing a trade book, if it's all photographs and very little text, is going to be, just by nature of the materials, quite likely much shorter than for a longer scholarly book. So we may try to ask for an accelerated timeline from our trade reviewers and let them know. But again, I mean, everyone's dealing with the same pressures in the post-pandemic world, and we simply have to respect those realities and get the best out of our peer review process that we can. So if we can shorten the timeline, we will, but we may not be able to due to realities.
Thank you. All right, next question I'm going to hand over to Mary. Are peer reviewers responsible for fact-checking a manuscript?
Stephanie, so yeah, one of the things that I mentioned in my segment was that we do ask reviewers to assess the factual accuracy of manuscripts. But we also understand that it's not this type of fact checking that you might think about when you think about someone fact checking every single detail. One of the reasons why we triangulate the appropriate peer reviewers for our project so carefully is because we try to select reviewers who have enough knowledge on the topic to be able to assess its factual accuracy. So we do want that feedback, but we don't necessarily expect reviewers to be checking in on every single detail and citation, for example. So yes, to some extent, to the extent that the reviewer is able to, yes.
Thank you. All right, next one for Janie. So I talked about the challenges of peer review, and I encouraged everyone to review manuscripts if they were asked. I didn't really talk about how peer reviewers benefit. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us about the how we add value to the peer reviewer experience.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Okay. So I think one of the things that happens is that the transparency of our peer review process isn't just the way to learn about what our best practices are. It's kind of an opportunity to engage in a larger conversation about what's happening in a particular scholarly discipline, to learn about what makes for effective communication to the general public, for instance, for trade books, but also for some of our scholarly books as well, and kind of the differences between effective short form and long form work. We sometimes have authors or potential authors who are used to writing articles either for scholarly publications or sometimes for a general public. We have journalists as well write books for us. And it's kind of a way for us to share our knowledge and insights about the book publication process. I think that that's particularly helpful if you're kind of early in your career, whether that is your career as a scholar or as a journalist. But I've personally found that even for people who've written books before, there's still a lot to be learned and value to kind of be had, because it's easy for us as editors, because this is our realm of expertise is in the book publication process, to not it's easy for us to not always know exactly what you do and what you don't. So we kind of want people to think of us as a resource, and to always be open with us. And, we're always happy to answer questions about what it's like to create a book, to collaborate, and just to kind of have a broader conversation.
Thank you. There's a question about AI. Does UPF use AI at any stage of the process? The answer is no, we do not, as far as I know. That's been a really interesting debate in scholarly publishing recently, but currently, no, we do not. Another question, and I'm not sure who to direct this one to. I might direct it to Sean. I'm sorry, Sean. It's a good one. If an author does not meet all of the peer review suggested changes, can your editors discount a hostile peer review, or are peer reviewers' approval required for the board to go forward?
So ultimately, each manuscript must have 2 positive reviews to go to the board. It's rare that you get 2 reviews that are 120,000% positive. They're going to be critical comments, probably, even in a peer review form that says you can publish it without revisions. But people notice things, and that's why, again, we do this process to get that feedback. If something's particularly critical in a review and it's not helpful, it's not something that the author either needs to take into consideration and to work into the manuscript revisions because it's outside the scope of the project, or maybe it's a methodology that is interesting, but really applies to another field or is not going to further the argument that this author is making. No, the author doesn't have to do that. That would not discount the review completely. Perhaps there are other elements in that review that provide feedback that can be used. So in that regard, that's one of the roles of an editor during that process, as Mary was outlining, is helping the author sift through the comments, looking at the comments that are like right on target, looking at the few, and usually it is relatively few that are pretty much out, and then there's a much larger column of comments that maybe it's not exactly what you need to do for that particular manuscript, but the fact that that reader has noticed something, you and the author can use that in your conversations to think strategically. How can I, as the author, how can the author improve their point or make their argument clearer so that you're using that comment in a productive way, but it may not be precisely the same comment that the reader brought up in the report. So it's a lot of gradients there, but that's that conversation between the author and the editor. And again, we do find that helps the process.
Thank you, Sean. All right, I'm going to do one last question. This is a big one. I'm not going to answer fully, but one of our listeners asked how we all became academic book editors and what our backgrounds are. And that could be a whole nother webinar. Like I could see us talking for a while about that in the future. But I want to pass this one over to Carlynn, because we do have an internship program, and Carlynn works with our acquisitions intern. So Carlynn, I thought you might say a little bit about the internship program and the applications.
Sure. So I actually started my career as an intern at the University Press of Florida a long time ago. Um, I think that internships are a really valuable way to get some insight into scholarly publishing for whatever your career goals are, whether you want to be a book editor, whether you want to be an academic yourself. We've had several interns who are graduate students who have learned more about the peer review process and have learned more about scholarly publishing in general before going on, to get professorship jobs and those sorts of things. So I would definitely encourage anyone to get in touch with me or any of my colleagues if they're interested in internships. I think those are a great way to kind of get your foot in the door, so to speak, about publishing. But you can also come from many different backgrounds. You don't have to just have interned with the press before to get a job in a press or a publishing house. You can be a writer yourself. You can be a scholar. There can be a lot of different ways to get involved with press publishing.
Definitely. Thank you, Carlynn. So I think Jenna put the link to our internship page in the chat. And I did want to note that all of our internships are paid. That's something that's been very important to us to make that change to paying all interns. So please reach out if you are interested in that. Take a look at the internship page. I think with that, we've answered the questions. I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you everyone so much for these great questions. I'm going to ask the editors to turn off their videos so that Carlynn can share that contact slide. So if you have any questions that were not addressed during the presentation, please reach out to one of us using the contact information on the screen and post it to the chat. We'll be emailing the contact information to all webinar registrants next week, and a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, Florida Press, and a link to the recording will be sent to all webinar registrants next week. To receive news and updates about the University Press of Florida and the amazing books that we publish, please visit upress.ufl.edu/subscribe. Thank you everyone so much for attending, and we hope you have a great weekend.